The wind had a voice that night, a wild, howling thing that carried the scent of dust, rain, and loneliness across the empty stretch of the Arizona plains. It screamed through the crooked wooden fences, tore at the dying brush, and wrapped itself around the broken wheels of an abandoned wagon. Beneath that furious sky, a young woman struggled to stay upright against the storm. Her name was Clara Wren, barely 20, small in frame but fierce in spirit, her pale blue dress torn at the hem and her bonnet long gone to the wind. She had been walking for hours, trying to follow the thin trail that led west toward Dry Creek, where she'd been promised work at a boarding house. But the sky had darkened faster than she'd expected, and now the desert had turned against her, the storm swallowing everything, sky and sand and hope alike. The air stung her cheeks as she pressed on, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Her boots, worn from weeks of travel, sank into the mud forming beneath the sudden rain. She'd lost her horse 2 hours earlier when lightning spooked it. The reins had slipped from her fingers and the animal bolted into the distance. Now she was alone, utterly alone in a country she did not yet understand. Each flash of lightning revealed only emptiness, the skeletons of cacti, the ghost shapes of tumbleweed, and the endless rolling dark. But Clara refused to give up. She'd crossed too many miles, shed too many tears, and survived too much silence since leaving Missouri to stop now. She was determined to find a place where she could start over, where her name wasn't whispered in pity for being left behind by a fiancé who'd chosen gold fever over her. She didn't know how long she'd been walking when her knees finally gave out. The rain came in sheets now, pelting the earth like stones. She fell onto her hands, breath ragged, hair clinging to her face. Somewhere behind her, thunder cracked, so close it rattled her bones. She tried to crawl, her palms sinking into the mud. Then, just as the storm seemed to close its jaws around her completely, a faint glow flickered through the darkness. A small orange light, moving toward her. For a moment she thought it might be a trick of the lightning, but then she heard it. The faint jingle of spurs, the muffled thud of boots against wet earth, and the low, steady voice of a man calling out over the wind. "Hey there. You lost?" The voice came again, closer now, calm but strong. The kind of voice that carried command even when spoken soft. Clara turned her head, blinking against the rain. A figure on horseback emerged from the storm. Tall, broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat dripping water. He swung down from the saddle with practiced ease, his lantern cutting through the shadows to reveal a rugged face marked by days in the sun and nights in the saddle. His coat was soaked, dust and rain clinging to him alike, but his movements were steady, sure, like a man who'd seen every kind of weather the frontier could throw at him. "Don't move," he said gently, kneeling beside her. His voice had a warmth that cut through the cold. "You'll only tire yourself out." Clara tried to speak, but her throat felt raw. "But my horse ran off," she managed, trembling. "I was trying to find Dry Creek." He looked over her shoulder toward the invisible horizon. "You're headed the right way, but it's another 6 miles at least. You wouldn't have made it in this weather." His gaze dropped to her hands, scraped and bleeding, then back to her eyes. "You're half frozen. Come on. I've got shelter not far from here." She hesitated. Years of being told not to trust strangers flickered in her mind. But another crack of thunder answered for her. The man extended his hand, palm up, patient as stone. Clara took it. His grip was warm, strong, grounding. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, guiding her toward his horse. The animal snorted softly, a black gelding with intelligent eyes. The man helped her up first, then climbed on behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her. She tensed at first. No man had held her like that in years, but his touch was respectful, protective, not possessive. As they rode, she could feel the strength in him, not just in his body but in his presence. He didn't talk much. Only once did he speak, shouting over the storm. "Name's Elias Boone. Don't worry, miss, we'll be out of this soon." It wasn't long before the faint outline of a cabin appeared in the darkness. The roof was low, built against the hill for shelter from wind, and smoke still drifted faintly from the chimney. Elias swung down and lifted her off the horse with surprising gentleness. "Inside," he said, guiding her through the door. The cabin was small. One room, a stove, a bed in the corner, a table cluttered with tools and half-carved wood. But to Clara it felt like heaven. The warmth of the fire hit her skin and she nearly cried from relief. Elias shut the door against the storm, then turned toward her, water dripping from his hat brim. Sit by the fire. I'll fetch you something dry. Clara sank onto the rug, hands trembling as she reached toward the flames. For the first time that night, she could see him clearly. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the dark hair brushing his collar, the quiet steadiness in his movements. He wasn't handsome in the polished sense, but there was something honest about him, something unshakable. When he returned with a blanket, he didn't stare or ask questions. He just handed it to her and crouched by the fire to pour water into a tin pot. "You're lucky I was out looking for strays," he said after a while. "This storm would have buried you by morning." Clara met his eyes, the flickering firelight softening the shadows between them. "I suppose I owe you my life, Mr. Boone." He gave a faint smile, the first she'd seen on his face. "Out here, we just call it being neighborly." But as she sat there, wrapped in his coat and surrounded by the scent of rain, leather, and pine smoke, Clara felt something more stirring quietly inside her. A warmth that didn't come from the fire alone. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside that cabin, beneath the steady gaze of the quiet cowboy who had found her in the wild, Clara Wren felt, for the first time in a long while, safe. When morning came, the storm had broken. The first light of dawn filtered through the narrow cracks between the cabin logs, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. The desert outside was quiet, soaked and shining, the air still heavy with the scent of rain. Clara woke slowly, wrapped in a wool blanket that wasn't hers. For a moment she didn't know where she was, only that the warmth around her felt safe. The air smelled faintly of coffee and smoke, and somewhere nearby a man's voice hummed a low tune. Then memory returned, the storm, the horse, the stranger who had lifted her from the mud. Elias Boone. She sat up quickly, eyes darting around the little cabin. The bed had been offered to her last night after she'd nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Elias had slept in a chair near the fire instead, hat tipped over his face. But now he was awake, already moving about the room, frying something in a pan over the stove. He glanced over when she stirred, and the smallest smile touched his lips. "Morning, Miss Wren, you made it through the night." Her cheeks warmed. "I should thank you for everything." He shrugged, flipping what looked like cornbread in the pan. "No thanks needed. You'd have done the same if it were me out there." She doubted that. She'd never met a man like him before. Most she'd known had been talkers, loud, boastful, always filling silence with swagger. Elias was different. He spoke little, moved with purpose, and seemed to wear solitude like an old coat, comfortably, almost naturally. His cabin, though humble, was neat and well kept. Tools hung on the wall, his rifle rested clean and oiled by the door, and above the hearth hung a faded photograph of a woman and a small boy. Clara's gaze lingered on that photograph. "Your family?" she asked softly. He turned his head, following her eyes, and for a moment the easy calm in his expression faltered. "Was," he said finally. "My sister and her boy. They're buried up near Tucson." The quiet that followed was not awkward, just deep, respectful. Clara lowered her eyes, sensing not to press further. Instead, she focused on the meal he placed before her a few moments later. Simple cornbread, beans, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. It tasted like survival. Warm, honest, made with care. "Thank you," she murmured again between bites. "I don't think I've eaten since yesterday morning." "Traveling alone?" he asked gently. She hesitated, fingers tightening on her tin cup. "Yes, I was supposed to meet a family in Dry Creek. The widow who runs the boarding house said she needed help. Cooking, cleaning. I thought maybe if I worked hard enough I could stay for good." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "A woman alone on the trail, that takes grit. You're lucky to have made it this far." She gave a small, almost self-conscious laugh. "Luck or stubbornness? My father used to say those two walk hand in hand." At the mention of her father, a shadow crossed her face. He died the year before, a fever that swept through their small Missouri town. When he passed, Clara's whole world had shifted. Her fiancé, Samuel Tate, had promised to marry her. But when rumors of gold spread, he'd left, taking her dowry savings with him. The memory still stung like a brand, but she didn't tell Elias that part, not yet. After breakfast, Elias stepped outside to tend his horse and check the pasture. Clara followed, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The land was vast, a sweep of sunlit desert and red rock, framed by distant hills still dusted with silver clouds. Birds darted across puddles left by the storm, and the world felt washed clean. "You live out here alone?" she asked, watching him throw feed into a trough. "Been that way a few years," he replied. "Had a partner once. We ran cattle together till he sold his share and lit out for California." "Guess I like quiet better than noise," Clara smiled faintly. "And yet you risked the storm to find a stranger." He met her gaze, calm, steady, unreadable. "Guess quiet's easier to stand when you've got a reason for it." "You looked like you needed one." There was no charm in his words, no flirtation, just honesty. That made it mean more. She looked away quickly, pretending to study the horizon, but her heart had already skipped once. By mid-morning, the sun grew stronger. Elias repaired a fence that had blown down in the storm, and Clara insisted on helping. She gathered scattered rails, her small hands raw from the work, but she refused to sit idle. "If I'm to rest under your roof another night," she said, half teasing, "then I should earn my keep." He chuckled under his breath, an almost shy sound. "Stubborn, just like you said." They worked in easy rhythm, speaking little. Now and then he'd glance her way, at how the sun caught the copper strands in her hair, or how determined her eyes looked when she lifted something twice her size. It stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years, admiration, maybe even a quiet kind of longing. But Elias Boone was not a man who let feelings show easily. The frontier had taken too much from him already to let hope come easy. When they finally rested by the fence, sweat and dust streaking both their faces, Clara looked out over the land and sighed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Lonely but beautiful," he nodded. "That's the West. She gives hard, but she gives honest. Everything you build here you earn." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken things. Clara turned to him. "Elias, if it's not too much trouble, could I stay a few days, just till I can find someone heading toward Dry Creek?" He looked at her for a long moment, the wind teasing loose strands of her hair, her eyes bright but uncertain. Then he gave a slow nod. "You can stay. Cabin's got room and you're no trouble." Her smile bloomed like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank you, truly." Elias only tipped his hat, turning away before she could see the faint flush on his cheeks. As the day stretched on, a quiet comfort settled between them. Clara helped mend the torn curtain in his window, cleaned the table, and even sang softly to herself while sweeping, an old hymn her mother used to hum. Elias, sitting by the fire later, listened without meaning to. Her voice was soft, lilting, and for the first time in years the cabin felt like more than just wood and dust. It felt like home. When dusk fell, he lit a lantern and poured 2 cups of coffee. She joined him by the table, the silence between them now easy, almost warm. Outside, the desert shimmered under a pale moon. "Elias," she said quietly, "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." He met her eyes, steady and kind. "You'd have found your way somehow. But I'm glad I was there." Something in the way he said it made her heart twist, not with fear this time, but with a fragile, unfamiliar hope. The days that followed passed like soft echoes of something neither Clara nor Elias dared name. Morning sun poured through the dusty windows, catching the smoke that rose from the fire where she cooked breakfast. Elias would already be outside at first light, repairing fences, checking his herd, or splitting wood, and every morning Clara would find a new way to thank him. A warm meal, a clean cabin, or a smile waiting by the door when he came in. For a man who had long forgotten what company felt like, her presence was like spring thawing the cold edges of a long winter. Clara herself began to feel her heart return to life in ways she hadn't thought possible. The prairie, which had first seemed endless and cruel, now shimmered with light and quiet beauty. She learned to listen to its language, the soft lowing of cattle, the cry of hawks circling above the canyon ridge, the sound of Elias's boots on the porch each evening. Every small thing began to matter, the way he removed his hat when speaking to her, the way he offered her the first cup of coffee, or how he always made sure the fire burned steady through the night so she'd be warm. She didn't know what made her heart ache more, his kindness, or the way he didn't seem to realize it was rare. By the 4th morning, she found him mending the corral fence again. The sky was cloudless, stretching forever in blue. "Mr. Boone," she called, carrying a bucket of water toward him. "You'll work yourself to death if you don't stop for a drink." He took the bucket, smiling faintly. "You ever notice how folks out here don't die easy? Work keeps the heart strong." Or wears it out, she teased, folding her arms. One or the other, his smile deepened just a hint. You sound like my sister. That name again, the sister whose picture hung above the hearth. Clara hesitated, unsure if she should ask. But before she could speak, Elias set the bucket down and glanced toward the horizon. I buried her 5 years ago. Fever took her and the boy both. Clara swallowed softly. I'm sorry, Elias, he nodded once, jaw tight. Storms take what they want, I guess. Out here you just keep building what's left. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind brushing past them like an unseen spirit. Then Clara reached out, lightly touching his arm. You've built something good here, she said softly. A place that feels alive again. He looked at her then. Really looked. Her eyes met his, clear as the morning light, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, understanding, maybe even longing. But he only said, Reckon it feels that way because of you. She turned quickly, pretending to busy herself with the bucket, but her cheeks burned pink. Later that day, Elias saddled his horse. Gotta ride into Dry Creek, he told her. Need supplies. You'll be safe here. Could I come? She asked, surprising them both. He hesitated. Town's not gentle, Miss Wren. A woman like you draws attention. I've faced worse than attention, she said, chin lifting. Besides, I'd like to see the place I nearly died trying to reach. He studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. All right. Stay close. The ride to Dry Creek took 2 hours. The trail wound through red canyons and wild sage, the air thick with the hum of cicadas. Clara's dress fluttered against the wind as she rode behind Elias, arms lightly around his waist. The rhythm of the horse's gait and the steady warmth of his back beneath her hands sent unfamiliar shivers through her. Not fear, but something deeper. Dry Creek was a typical frontier town. One main street lined with saloons, stables, a church, and a general store whose sign creaked in the wind. As they dismounted, Clara noticed how heads turned. Curious glances, some kind, some not. The West had its ways, and strangers always drew eyes. Inside the general store, Elias gathered what they needed. Flour, coffee, salt, cartridges. The shopkeeper, a broad man with a bristled beard, grinned at Clara. Don't often see a lady riding in with Boone. You finally find yourself a Mrs. Elias? Elias's brow furrowed, his voice quiet but firm. She's a guest. Leave it there. The man raised his hands, chuckling. Didn't mean nothing by it. Just curious, that's all. But Clara caught the flicker in Elias's eyes, something protective, almost possessive. She felt her pulse quicken as she looked down at her gloves, pretending to study a tin of sugar. Outside, the sun beat hard on the street. A few men lounged by the saloon porch, watching her too long. One, tall and lanky with a mean grin, spat tobacco and muttered, Pretty thing to be keeping company with Boone. Man's got taste. I'll give him that. Before she could react, Elias was there, his hand clamping down on the man's shoulder. Say another word, he said evenly, and I'll make you swallow your teeth. The man froze, then laughed nervously. Easy there, Boone. Didn't mean nothing by it. Elias let him go, jaw tight, eyes hard as flint. He turned to Clara, voice low. You all right? She nodded shakily, her breath catching. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said simply. I did. They left town in silence, the weight of that moment trailing them down the dusty road. Only when the cabin came into view again did the tension ease. Elias dismounted first and helped her down. His hand lingered at her waist a heartbeat longer than it needed to. Neither spoke of it. That evening the sky burned with streaks of gold and crimson. Clara cooked stew while Elias chopped wood outside. When he finally came in, his shirt damp with sweat, she handed him a bowl and smiled. For a man who likes quiet, you sure make a lot of noise chopping. He chuckled softly. Gotta do something to keep from thinking too much. She tilted her head. And what is it you think about? He hesitated, staring into the firelight. Used to think about what I lost. Lately, he looked up, meeting her gaze. Lately, I think about what's found its way back. Her heart stilled. The air between them thickened, warm, fragile, electric. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then, as if the world had shifted in some unseen way, Elias reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, reverent. Clara didn't pull away. The fire cracked. The wind sighed through the cracks of the cabin walls, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw his guard lower. the quiet cowboy who'd carried her from the storm, looking at her not as a stranger, but as someone who'd somehow become part of his world. He drew his hand back slowly. "You should get some rest," he murmured, voice thick. Clara nodded, though her heart was far too awake for sleep. That night, as the moon rose over the desert and the coyotes called from afar, two souls lay under the same roof, one on the bed, one in the chair by the fire, both listening to the same quiet, both knowing something had changed forever. The next morning came with a strange hush, the kind that settled over the desert before something broke loose. Clara felt it as soon as she stepped outside, the sky already heavy with gray. Elias was saddling his horse, movement slower than usual, eyes sharp and restless. "You're heading out early," she said, tying her shawl tighter against the breeze. He nodded without looking up. "Heard word in town yesterday. Some drifters been working the trails east of here. Robbing travelers, rustling cattle. I need to check the herd." Clara frowned. "Can't you wait till after breakfast?" He smiled faintly. "Can't feed the cattle with pancakes, Miss Wren." It was meant to be light, but she caught the tension in his tone. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "Just be careful." He looked down at her, surprise softening his face. "Always am." She watched him ride off, a lone figure cutting through the vast land until he disappeared beyond the ridge. The hours that followed stretched thin with silence. She busied herself with chores, washing dishes, mending a shirt of his she found torn near the shoulder. But her thoughts kept drifting toward the horizon. Something in her chest twisted with worry she couldn't quite name. By noon, the wind had changed direction. The air smelled faintly of smoke. Clara stepped outside, scanning the distance. That's when she saw it. 3 riders moving slow through the valley below, dark figures against the pale sand. They weren't Elias. Her pulse quickened. She ducked back into the cabin, heart pounding. Whoever they were coming this way. Minutes later, hooves thundered in the yard. The door creaked open before she could bar it. The man who stepped in first was tall and thin, a scar running down his cheek. Behind him came 2 others, dust-stained and grinning the way wolves do when they see something cornered. "Well now," the scarred one drawled. "Ain't this a surprise? Didn't think Boone kept company out here." Clara's breath hitched. "He's not here," she said quickly. "He'll be back any moment." The man's grin widened. "Good. Saves us the trouble of hunting him down." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Name's Rafe Harlan. Used to ride with Boone, till he got all noble and decided he was too good for our work. So that was it. Elias is passed. Come knocking." Clara's stomach turned cold. "What do you want?" she asked, voice trembling. "Just saying hello? Maybe taking a few things he don't need no more." Rafe's eyes roamed the room. The rifle by the door, the saddle, the tin of coins on the table. "And maybe having a little company while we wait." Clara backed away, her hand brushing against the poker by the hearth. "You won't find any here," she said, steadying her voice. The other men chuckled. "Feisty one of them muttered. Rafe stepped closer, his smile gone. "You got fire, I'll give you that." But fire burns out fast. Before he could reach her, the crack of a rifle split the air. The window shattered, and Rafe stumbled back, a bullet grazing his sleeve. "Leave her." Elias's voice thundered from outside. Chaos erupted. The men dove for cover, returning fire through the doorway. Clara dropped to the floor, heart pounding as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Elias's shots came fast, precise. One man fell, clutching his leg. Another's hat flew clean off his head. Rafe cursed, shoving the wounded man aside. "Boone, you always were a fool for playing hero." Elias's answer came cold as steel. "Step away from the cabin," the outlaw sneered. "Come take me yourself." Silence followed, heavy, breathless, then the sound of boots crunching in the dirt. Clara crawled to the window and saw Elias walking toward them, rifle raised, eyes hard and steady. Rain had begun again, spattering his hat brim, streaking his face with mud. Rafe fired first. The shot missed. Elias's didn't. The outlaw crumpled, his gun falling from his hand. The others fled, dragging the wounded one with them. For a long moment, all Clara could hear was the rain and her own ragged breathing. Then Elias was at the door, stepping inside, eyes searching for her. "Clara," he said hoarsely. "You hurt?" She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "No, but you—" He winced, glancing down. Blood darkened his sleeve, a shallow graze. Just a scratch. Before he could say more, she was in his arms. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She simply threw herself against him, burying her face in his chest. His arms came around her instantly, strong and sure. For a man who'd built his life on silence, he held her like she was the only sound that mattered. When she finally pulled back, her voice trembled. "You could have been killed." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I've been close before, but this time I had a reason not to be." Her breath caught. The fire flickered behind them, casting gold light across his face. She saw it then. Not just the quiet strength or the loneliness he carried, but the fierce protectiveness beneath it. "Who were they?" she whispered. "Men I used to ride with," he admitted. "Before I came to my senses. We ran with a bad crowd. Rustlers, thieves. I left before it got darker." Rafe didn't forgive that. She studied him. The man who'd saved her from the storm, who'd risked his life without a second thought. "You changed," she said softly. He shook his head. "Didn't change. Just got tired of running from what I knew was wrong." Her hand brushed his cheek. "Then you're a better man than you think, Elias Boone." For a long moment, neither moved. The rain outside softened, the storm losing its edge. Elias's breath came slow, steady, as though grounding himself in the simple fact that she was safe. Finally, he said quietly, "You can still go to Dry Creek if you want. It'll be safer now." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" He looked at her for a long time, the weight of years of solitude behind his gaze. "I want you safe, but if staying means danger follows." He trailed off, unable to finish. She reached for his hand. "Maybe safety isn't what I came here to find." His fingers tightened around hers. Something shifted between them, no longer unspoken, no longer fragile, just real. Outside, the clouds broke, sunlight spilling over the soaked earth like a blessing. Inside the cabin, Elias Boone, the quiet cowboy who'd once lived only for the work and the silence, finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't dared to in years: hope. 3 days passed since the gunfight, and the desert seemed to breathe easier. The wind no longer carried the taste of smoke or fear, only the faint sweetness of mesquite blooming after rain. Elias's shoulder healed fast, though Clara suspected he downplayed the pain, pretending it was nothing worth fussing over. She tended him anyway, her gentle hands dabbing the wound, her quiet humming filling the cabin until even the silence felt alive. Each night, when the lamps burned low, he'd sit by the fire while she read from the worn book she'd found in her trunk. It was some old collection of poems, but she gave each word such warmth that even the roughest verses softened. Elias would listen without speaking, his eyes tracing the flames while her voice carried through the room like a lullaby. He didn't know how it happened, how the cabin that had once felt too small for anything but loneliness now felt like a world big enough to hold everything he'd ever wanted. On the 4th morning, he found her outside, kneeling by the corral. The sun rose slow and gold, lighting her hair like strands of fire. She was feeding the horses, one palm open, her laughter ringing soft as the animals nuzzled her. "Morning," he called. She turned, brushing stray hair from her cheek. "You're supposed to be resting. Can't rest with you doing all the work," he said, leaning on the post. "Besides, I heal faster when I'm near sunshine." She smiled, that small, honest kind of smile that reached her eyes. "That's a fine excuse, Mr. Boone." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Ain't an excuse, Miss Wren, just truth." For a moment, neither spoke. The morning was so still they could hear the creak of the barn door, the whisper of the grass, the heartbeat of the land itself. Then quietly, Clara said, "I used to think the world only wanted me to run, from one place to the next, never staying long enough to belong." Elias nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. Used to think peace was a thing other folks got lucky with. And now?" she asked, eyes lifting to his. He took a deep breath, the words coming low and certain. "Now I think peace is something you fight for. Same as land, same as love." Her lips parted, a tremor in her voice. "You talk about love like it's a choice." "It is," he said. "And I've made mine." The air between them seemed to thrum. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the corral. Clara looked away for a heartbeat, her chest rising, her eyes glistening. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. "I know what it cost you to save me." He stepped closer until only a breath separated them. "I didn't save you out of debt. I saved you because you made this place worth living in again." Her hand trembled as he took it, rough fingers closing gently around hers. The contrast of calloused strength and soft skin made her heart race. When I first saw you, she said quietly, you looked like a man carved out of the desert itself. Strong, stubborn, untouchable. I never thought you'd even let me stay. He smiled faintly. I didn't think I would either. And now? He tilted her chin up, his voice a whisper lost in the wind. Now I can't think of this land without seeing you in it. For the first time, she didn't hold back. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him, slow, deep, trembling with all the words neither had spoken for weeks. His arms came around her, pulling her close as though the world might take her away if he didn't hold tight enough. The taste of dust and rain mingled between them. And when they parted, the storm inside both their hearts finally quieted. Guess that means I'm staying, she breathed. Guess it does, he murmured, brushing his thumb over her cheek. The days that followed stitched themselves into something close to paradise. Clara planted a small garden behind the cabin, sage, cornflowers, and a few stubborn sprouts of corn. Elias built her a fence, carved her name into the wooden post like it was sacred. They rode together to town one morning, and for the first time, people smiled when they saw him. Some nodded, some tipped their hats. Even the sheriff, who once distrusted him, said, "Good to see you back among folks, Boone." Clara laughed on the ride home, wind in her hair. "You're a legend now," he grinned. "Only thing I care to be is yours." That night, as the sky turned violet and the stars began to bloom, Clara stood on the porch, gazing across the land. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked softly. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Only that tomorrow I'll still wake up next to you." She leaned back against him. "You make that sound like forever." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Reckon it is, far as I'm concerned." The moon rose, silver and kind, spilling light over the hills and the quiet cabin that now held two hearts instead of one. The desert wind carried the faint sound of laughter. Hers, mingled with his, and somewhere out there the coyotes sang their lonely songs, not out of sorrow but something that almost sounded like joy. Weeks passed and the land bloomed again. The wildflowers returned, painting the valley in color. The scars on Elias's shoulder faded, and the ones in his heart healed too. Not because time willed it, but because love did. One evening as the sun sank low, he brought her to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place she'd seen the storm rolling in weeks ago, the same place she'd first realized she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Elias knelt, not with ceremony but with quiet honesty. In his hands was a small silver band, simple and beautiful. "Clara Wren," he said softly. "You walked into my life when I thought I'd stopped deserving anything good. You taught me how to breathe again. So if you'll have me, I'd be proud to spend whatever time this earth gives me calling you my wife." Her breath caught, tears shining in the fading light. "You're sure?" she whispered. He smiled. That rare, unguarded smile that had once seemed impossible. Never been sure of anything. Clara dropped to her knees and kissed him, the wind swirling around them like an old blessing. "Then yes," she said against his lips. 1,000 times yes. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with gold and crimson, they stood hand in hand, two souls who had once been lost to silence, now bound by a love the West itself seemed to honor. The cabin behind them would one day be called Boone's Haven, a place travelers spoke of, where kindness grew from hardship, and where a quiet cowboy finally found the one thing he never knew he needed: a heart that finally belonged.